Hi, my name's Mike, and this is why I think DNA is an evolutionary enigma. So, deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is extremely complex coded information, and if we carefully examine the latest research, it is impossible for DNA to have evolved by random mutations and natural selection. There are no sensible, naturalistic explanations for DNA. Digital coded information can only come from a mind. I like to call DNA divine nano applications because it's supernatural in nature. So let's take a look at the amazing complexity of DNA. This is Bill Gates, founder of the Microsoft Corporation, and he says DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. Far, far more advanced than any software ever created by man. And he should know, shouldn't he? The most genius computer expert in the world. Now, you'll have all heard of the Human Genome Project. Well, there's been a lot of work done by the E.N.C.O.D.E program. The E.N.C.O.D.E program, it's an acronym for Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, and it started in 2003 in earnest, and it's ongoing. It's a worldwide multi-university, multi-million-dollar and multi-year study of the human animal genome, and an amazing amount of information has come out of that program, and it's still going on now. Since the E.N.C.O.D.E project, over 1,000 PhD scientists have signed dissentfromdarwin.org as they realise that there is an intelligent designer, a creator, and no evolution. And thousands more scientists agree and would like to sign the list, but they would possibly lose their tenure and their job if they did. Now here's the list. It's going to scroll now. I downloaded this in 2016, and anyone can go to this list. Just go to dissentfromdarwin.org and you can even download the list yourself, and you can see all these scientists that do not believe in evolution because they're seeing all the complexity that's coming out of the E.N.C.O.D.E program. And unfortunately, all the science labs, all the universities, they're all run by Darwinists. And so people who oppose Darwin and evolution, they tend to be ostracized, and they have a hard time, and they even get sacked. It's a shame. But these scientists are saying we're skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life, because they're seeing how complex it is. So it's 70 years ago since Watson and Crick first discovered the DNA double helix, but DNA is far more complex than anyone ever imagined, and the amount of information they've found out in the last decade is unbelievable. DNA, if we look at it carefully, is essentially the body plan, instruction and maintenance manual that was created for each individual life form in the very beginning. And DNA is in every living thing on the earth, and every species has a unique separate DNA code. It's absolutely amazing. Let's just have a think about man's binary computer code, noughts and ones. As I've said, we need the mind of a computer programmer to write our computer programs like Microsoft Word or PowerPoint. It's in our phones, in our laptops, in our TVs, it's in everything, the binary code. Information can only come from a mind, and only the mind of the intelligent designer could have programmed the DNA that is in all life. But God didn't use noughts and ones. God created the four-dimensional, four-letter DNA code, A, T, G, C, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, and DNA codons. And they call them codons because it's coded information. DNA codes for proteins. The codons in the DNA translate into RNA, and RNA transcribes into protein chains. But the amazing thing is, proteins make DNA. Both are symbiotic. You cannot have one without the other. It's like the chicken and the egg scenario. They all had to be created in the very beginning, all in one go. There are two major types of changes which have been discovered in the DNA by the E.N.C.O.D.E research: built-in variation via existing genes which are predictable in the gene pool, and they were front-loaded at the beginning of creation, allowing for purposeful adaptation. So think about Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands. There were some finches with big beaks, some with little beaks, but that was adaptation to, if there was dry seasons when the seeds were hard to crack, the finches grew bigger beaks over a period of time. And in rainy seasons when the seeds were a lot softer, the finches would then lose the big beaks and get smaller beaks. But those finches, they're still flying around the Galapagos Islands just like they were 150 years ago. They're still finches. They haven't changed into anything else. Humans, we can adapt our bodies. There's a before and an after. And there's a man with some lovely muscles there because he's done lots of exercise, weight training. We've got all the information in our DNA, in our bodies, to be able to adapt to different circumstances. If you think about people who live in high places, the oxygen is a bit less up there, but we can adapt to that. People who have different diets because their food sources are limited, they can adapt. It's adaptation. Now, the second one, random chance mutations. They are accidental copying errors and they're unpredictable. And this is the evolutionary assumed mechanism. Discoveries made in the last few decades by the E.N.C.O.D.E research show just how complex the DNA code really is, and how genetic mutations detrimentally affect the complex information in the code. Now, what follows is a very detailed video that explains the E.N.C.O.D.E DNA research in very simplified terms because it's extremely complex. And the video is from one of J.C.Seigert, he's a PhD, one of his presentations, which can be found at thestartingpointproject.org. I recommend you check him out because he puts things in layman's terms, because the science of this is also very, very complex. So this will explain just how complex DNA is and how genetic mutations detrimentally affect the information in the code.
Well, we're now going to take a closer look at these mutations. Can they do what evolutionists tell us they actually do? I'm going to make three major points. Number one, that they are random, purposeless, and undirected. Number two, they occur in the DNA. And number three, they are almost entirely detrimental or bad. Start out with number one, random, purposeless, and undirected. Here's a quote from Nova Online. This is a secular source, an evolutionary source, and this is what they say. It's sometimes convenient when trying to make sense of evolution to think of changes within a species of having a purpose, as though Mother Nature has some intended goal that she sets out to achieve. The bacteria want to survive, someone might reason when thinking about the declining effects of antibiotics, and so they evolve into resistant strains. Of course, there is no purpose in evolution, just random mutations within DNA, most of which are detrimental to the survivability of the organism. Those are the 3 points that I just made. When I was putting the talk together, I made that previous slide, and then I found this quote after that, and I thought, that's pretty cool. Those are the 3 points that I'm going to be making. So they are admitting, evolutionary source admitting there's not a purpose behind evolution. It's not trying to achieve something. It just copies its DNA. Second point here, These mutations are occurring in the DNA. I'll go through this really quick here. Most of you are familiar with DNA. It's like a very, 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 very complex blueprint with lots and lots and lots and lots of information on it. Well, let's talk about the storage capacity of DNA. Let's say you had just a teaspoon amount of your own DNA, and you wanted to back that up onto a thumb drive. We back up our computers in case they crash. So you have a teaspoon amount of your DNA, and you want to back it up on a 64 gig thumb drive. That's a big thumb drive. It can hold almost 10 million pages of text on a 64 gig thumb drive. How much space of that thumb drive would that take up? Just a teaspoon amount of your DNA. How many drives would you need? How about 1,000 drives? That would be a lot, but we need more. How about 1,000,000 drives? That's unbelievable, but that's still not quite enough. You'd have to have someone give you 1,000,000 drives every day for 139 years, and then you'd have enough storage space to back up just what can fit in a teaspoon amount of your own DNA. It's incredible to me. That screams design, but some people want to believe that just happened by accident. So DNA, it's like a set of encyclopedias that we don't use anymore, but you probably still know at least what they are. And the rungs on the ladder, that's what we call nucleotides. Those are like individual letters from the set of encyclopedias. When you group a bunch of rungs together, a bunch of nucleotides, you can create words. When you put thousands or tens of thousands of these rungs or nucleotides together, that would make a chapter, one chapter out of the whole set of encyclopedias, and that's what we refer to as a gene. Then, when you put thousands of genes together, that's a chromosome, and that would be like a single volume out of the entire set of encyclopedias. And then, when you consider the entire set of encyclopedias, that's what we call the genome. For people, we call it the human genome. A little bit of biology 101. Most people probably already knew that. So, the last portion, which is going to be the most interesting, because so far it's been pretty plain actually. But we're going to really pick things up here, and it's going to get exciting and fun and just absolutely incredible. These mutations are almost entirely detrimental or bad. So here's the story of evolution. Again, not trying to be sarcastic. Let's say that the amount of information in a biochemistry textbook is about the amount of information we find in a single celled organism. That's actually true. It's about how much information is in a single cell. But remember, we have to turn that cell all the way into a human being, which means we need to make changes to that cell. So here's a book. This is Biological Information, New Perspectives. This is a book that was put together after that conference at Cornell University. So we're just going to open up to a single page here and highlight some text and put that text off to the left. We can't just copy this book over and over and over. Otherwise, millions of years from now, we'll just have a lot of copies of the same book. If we want to turn it into something much better, like a human being, you'd have to make changes to it. Well, what are these changes? The changes are going to be mutations, and evolutionists admit mutations are the only game in town. It's the only way to get the raw information required by evolution. So let's take a look what mutations look like. First of all, we have a duplication mutation. You take the word level, you put an extra L in there. We're duplicating that letter. It doesn't spell level anymore. No, chances are if you were reading a book and you saw that, you'd say, oh, it's just a typo. It's level, and you'd move on. That's not how our genes work. It would see that and say, I've never seen this before. It's useless. It destroyed that piece of information. Then we have a deletion mutation. You take the M out of model. It doesn't spell model anymore. That's a deletion mutation. Then we have a substitution mutation. You take the P out of probability, put a Z in there instead. It doesn't spell probability. Here's what's interesting. You could ask a 5-year-old child what their favorite book is, and then they tell you the name of the book. Then you ask them, if we took your book, closed our eyes, opened up to a random page, stuck our finger on the page, and whatever letter we touched, we put an extra one of those letters in. And then we close our eyes and open up to another page, touch the letter, whatever letter we touch, we delete it. Do it again, whatever letter we touch, we take that letter out and put a random different letter in there. If we keep doing that to your book, what will happen? Will your book get better and better? A 5-year-old child will say, no, it will get worse and worse. In fact, pretty soon I won't even be able to read it. A 5-year-old understands that. You have to be highly educated to not get this. And what I mean by that is these PhD scientists who truly are brilliant often don't get it or don't want to know about it. And it's largely a spiritual issue. They're spiritually blinded. It's not that they're not smart enough, they're plenty smart. I think they're smarter than I am. But the Bible says that there's a big difference between intelligence and wisdom. The Bible says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And many of these scientists, they don't fear God. A lot of them don't even believe in God. So they lack the wisdom and the proper worldview and starting point to use to interpret the facts. They have enough facts in their head. They're just interpreting them incorrectly because of their errant worldview. So the challenge, though, for evolution gets much worse than that. Given a lot of background information, this is where it gets fun because the challenge for evolution, it just goes off the charts at this point. And it has to do with information structure, meaning how is the information actually written on the DNA? When you find out how it's written, that's where you see very clearly the whole story of evolution. It just can't happen. Now, as a simple analogy, let's say you're reading a section of your DNA and it spells out, was it a rat I saw? Kind of a strange sentence. In English, we read from left to right. But you may have already noticed you can read that backwards. Was it a rat I saw? It's called a palindrome. Not a very meaningful phrase, but it is kind of fun. You can read it forwards and backwards. Well, guess what? This is what we discovered about much of our DNA. Much of it can not only be read forwards, it can also be read backwards, but the complexity challenge gets worse than that because that's the same message both ways. It's not an additional message, it's just the same message both ways. So the challenge gets worse with this analogy. Take a look at the word desserts. You flip that around and it spells stressed, which is what I get when I don't get desserts. So let's take this message system here and introduce one of our wonderful mutations, which is going to eventually turn that cell into a human being. We'll just introduce a deletion mutation. We'll delete the T randomly. Well, it doesn't spell desserts anymore, but it also doesn't spell stressed. One change messed up two messages because you can read it forwards and backwards. But guess what? We don't see little words in our DNA that you can read forwards and backwards. We see up to entire chapters of complex instructions that can be read forwards and backwards. And let me give you an analogy so you know exactly what that means. Let's say you have a job working for a cell phone company, and it's your job to write the instruction manual to give to the manufacturing plant so they can make the phones. That's what you do. So your boss comes to you one day and says, I have a project for you. I need you to write the chapter in the manual that will explain how the phone is going to download apps from the web. You say, yeah, I can do that. He says, thanks. He's walking away and then he turns around and goes, oh, sorry. One minor detail. When you write that chapter, you have to write it in such a way, if we read your chapter backwards, it will explain how the phone's going to play music files. And then you're laughing at him saying, yeah, that's a good one. He says, no, I'm serious. We only have so much room in the manual. Your chapter has to make sense both ways. Okay, that's humanly impossible. It cannot be done. You can't even program a computer to do that. I did computer programming for 12 years. It's impossible. But that's what we're seeing in our DNA. Back up a second. You read a section one direction. It's a set of very, very complex instructions that code to make certain proteins that carry out a specific function in your body. Now you read that segment backwards. It's a completely different set of very complex instructions that make completely different proteins that carry out a completely different function in your body. Two major points with this. Number one, particles interacting in nature over time could never create a complex information system that you can read both forwards and backwards. And number two, even if you had an information system like that, when you make random changes to it over time, you will not be improving it. You will be destroying it faster and faster because most of the times you're making a change, you're messing up two messages. But the challenge for evolution gets worse than that. We not only have forwards and backwards messages, we have overlapping messages. Take a look at this phrase, I like choco later that evening. Kind of strange because it's two phrases that overlap. I like chocolate, which is true, and then later that evening. These two phrases overlap in the middle. They share these four letters here. So let's introduce one of our random mutations here. We'll just randomly take the E out and put a Z in there instead. It doesn't spell I like chocolate. It doesn't spell later that evening. One change messed up two messages because they overlap. And this is what we have in our DNA. But our DNA doesn't have just a few letters that overlap. It has up to entire chapters of complex instructions that overlap each other. It is unbelievably complex. But guess what? The challenge for evolution gets worse than that. We also have spliced information. Same phrase again. This time, let's underline a few segments and bring them down below. And it spells, I like her hat. It's called a spliced message. This is what we're finding in our DNA. We have spliced messages. So let's introduce a random mutation. We'll just delete the H. It doesn't spell I like chocolate, but it also now doesn't spell I like her hat because it messed up the main message and it messed up the spliced message. But we don't see just a few letters that can be spliced out of our DNA. We see up to long sentences and short paragraphs that can be spliced out. What does that mean? Take a biochemistry textbook, read the whole thing. You just learned a lot of information. Now you go back and you just pull out long sentences from one place and short paragraphs from another place. You keep doing that. You put them all together. You got another chapter of instructions there. It can't be done. We can't write something like that, but that's what we're finding in our DNA. But the challenge gets worse than that. We have embedded messages in our DNA. Take a look at this phrase. Can you show Mike Owen checks from Oliver's latest facts and set it on the desk? Okay, let's circle every eighth letter here and then bring those down below. And it spells, I like chocolate. There's a theme going on here. It's my talk. I can do that. This is an embedded message. So let's introduce one of our wonderful mutations. We'll delete the H. What that would do is it would shift over all the letters after that space where we deleted a letter. So now the eighth letters are these letters. You bring those down below, and it's completely meaningless. One change messed up the main sentence, but it also messed up the embedded message. Again, the information structure here is unbelievably complex. But the challenge gets worse than that. We have encrypted messages in our DNA. I actually had 3 interviews with the CIA to work in their cryptographic analysis division. Kind of a creepy story for some other time. But let's take a look at encrypted messages and what that means. So we have a phrase going across the screen here. It seems pretty meaningless. But what if you found out there was an encryption key, meaning everywhere there's an H, it's really an A. Everywhere there's a B, it's a C. Everywhere there's a W, it's a D. Everywhere there's a Y, it's a T. So those two Ys, those are really T's. So if you make all the substitutions, you find out it spells this is an encrypted message. Kind of cool. That's one way of doing data encryption. This is what we've been finding in our DNA. There's also encrypted messages. So let's take a second to think through what would be required to create an encrypted message system, keeping in mind there's no God, there's no creator, there's no designer. It's just particles interacting in nature over time. What would these particles have to do to come up with an encrypted message system? This is what they'd have to do. First of all, they would have to develop a language system using symbols. So when you got 3 sticks like that, if you put them together this way, we're going to call that an A. And if you have 3 shapes like this and put them together this way, we're going to call that a B. You have to create an entire alphabet by particles banging together in nature. Secondly, you have to be able to create and define words. When you put those 4 letters together, it's going to represent that object. You have to create an entire dictionary of words and definitions by particles banging together in nature. You have to be able to write meaningful sentences and paragraphs, which requires rules of grammar. How do you create rules of grammar? By particles banging together in nature. Then you have to establish the encryption system with that key that I mentioned before. After that, you have to create the system that does the coding and the decoding. And then you have to develop the ability to read and carry out the instructions, or the whole thing is useless. There is not a scientist on the planet who can even begin to explain how particles interacting can do any of this. But that's what we're seeing in our DNA. One last time, I'm skipping a few details. You can thank me for that. But the challenge gets worse. We actually have 3D information in our DNA. This is a little bit harder to depict with PowerPoint, but I'll do my best here. When the DNA makes proteins, they're not these little short ladders. They're actually very, very complex three-dimensional folds. And if they're not folded just right, like a lock and a key, they're useless and they're disassembled and the components are reused. So I'm going to put 7 words on the screen here, just kind of random words, and I'm going to fold these words, again, best I can in PowerPoint. You'll just stack them on top of each other. When we stack these words this way, you'll notice going up and down, there's an additional piece of information, the word success. Now, obviously, if you delete letters, substitute letters, duplicate letters, you're going to mess that up. But also, if you don't fold it right, you fold it this way, you lose that piece of information. And that's what we have in our DNA. When it gets folded, certain portions are now on top of each other that weren't by each other before. By reading up and down, there's additional piece of information, and that can even change over time to give you additional pieces of information. It is unbelievably complex. So wrapping this whole thing up, certain things might look pretty good from a certain distance or a certain angle, like the bright red BMW. Again, we envisioned opening the hood and seeing a beautiful engine. Well, we just opened the hood on evolution to find out the engine's missing. There's nothing to drive evolution. There's nothing to give you the astronomical amount of new complex information to turn a single cell into a human being. Here's a quote from a geneticist. He said, "Genetics has no proofs for evolution. It has trouble explaining it. The closer one looks at the evidence for evolution, the less one finds of substance. In fact, the theory keeps on postulating evidence and failing to find it, moves on to other postulates. Fossil missing links, natural selection of improved forms, positive mutations, etc. This is not science."
How incredible is the complexity of God's created DNA? It's on levels that are far beyond our understanding. And the longer the E.N.C.O.D.E research goes on, the more and more they find. But they'll never get to the end of the complexity of the human animal genome, because it's divine and it's supernatural in design. It's not natural selection or random chance. The next few clips are of designed molecular motors, and if we use our common sense, they are impossible for evolution.
For the molecular motors that drive bacteria through liquid, each depend upon a system of intricately arranged mechanical parts. These parts come into focus when portions of a cell are magnified 50,000 times. Biochemists have used electron micrographs like this one to identify the parts and three-dimensional structure of the flagellar motor. In the process, they have revealed a marvel of engineering on a miniaturized scale.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe. These machines, some of them are running at 100,000 RPMs and are hardwired into a signal transduction or sensory mechanism so that it's getting feedback from the environment.
So the bacteria flagellum, it's irreducibly complex. And that means that it's made of proteins, and if you take one of those proteins away, the whole thing won't work. And the other thing about it is it's absolutely impossible to evolve. It has to follow the instructions in the DNA exactly right to actually create the flagellum in the first place. It even has a clutch. So when it's swimming, the clutch is engaged. And when it stops, the clutch is disengaged. And these little bacteria, they know exactly where they're going in the body, and they know their jobs and exactly what they do, because they've got all the information in the DNA that tells them what to do.
Meet the kinesin. Masterpieces of microengineering, kinesins are miniature motorized machines that carry cargo from one part of the cell to another, walking along self-assembling highways called microtubules. Known as the workhorses of the cell, kinesins have 2 feet, or globular heads, that literally walk 1 foot over another along the microtubule, pulling their cargo to its destination.
Not a chance of evolving. This is purposely divinely designed and created. Now, you saw the kinesin walking along the tubules there. Well, that slowed down to show us how it happens, but it happens in microseconds.
It's been called one of the wonders of the molecular world, an amazing nanoscale machine. ATP synthase is a high-tech micromolecular power generator inside the cells of your body. It generates adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, an energy molecule that provides fuel that every one of your cells needs to function. Without this fuel, your cells will cease operation, and so will you. ATP synthase works like a rotary engine. The barrel-shaped rotator is composed of 10 to 15 protein parts called subunits. The rotator spins around, transmitting mechanical energy into the drive shaft of the machine, which helps make ATP. This drive shaft has a specially placed bump that opens and closes parts as the drive shaft spins around. This bump opens special protein subunits on the bottom of the machine. When the bottom subunits open, a spent energy molecule called adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, enters the machine. The mechanical motion causes the ADP to bind with an additional phosphate group, creating the ATP energy molecule. And the ATP drifts off into the cell, ready to power some biomechanical reaction. The ATP synthase machine has many parts we recognize from human-designed technology: a rotor, a stator, a drive shaft, and other basic components of a rotary engine. The ATP synthase is one of thousands of elegantly designed molecular machines inside your cells that make your life and all known life possible. ATP synthase, an example of intelligent design.
ATP synthase, molecular motors, are energy machines. And you can see many more of these molecular machines, because there's hundreds of them, at discoveryinstitute.org. Check them out. So we all know who that is, don't we? That's Darwin. And in his first edition of Origin of the Species, on page 154, it said, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, then my theory would absolutely break down. But then," he said, "but I can find no such case." But if Darwin was alive today and he saw all the information coming out of the E.N.C.O.D.E program about DNA, he would actually say, nah, my theory doesn't work. It's broken down because it's just too complex. Well, how about the bacteria flagellum, or the kinesin, or the ATP synthase, Charlie? But what have we got? All our kids in schools being taught that evolution is a fact, and it's not a fact. It's all misguided information and a load of propaganda.
Game over.
Bugs with gears.
We don't typically ponder the elegance of bugs, especially the annoying ones. But scientists and engineers have come to realize they are actually mechanical marvels. Nothing we humans have ever built even comes close. In fact, a growing field of engineering called biomimetics is making breakthroughs by mimicking biology. For example, studying the eyes of flies led to the development of advanced optical sensors. The physics of dragonfly wings allowed increased efficiency of wind turbines. Cockroach mechanics paved the way for increased agility in robots. A honeybee algorithm helped to optimize the internet. And the tiny plant hopper is helping scientists to maximize the strength and rotation of gears.
What? Gears? In a bug? That one got my attention. I thought humans invented gears.
Those perfectly precise, interconnected drivers that have transformed machinery for centuries. Well, it turns out that biology is far ahead of our engineering. The plant hopper launches like a rocket and can jump more than 100 times its body length. That's like an Olympic long jumper hurtling across not one, but 2 football fields. Using special cameras, scientists at Cambridge University discovered that the plant hopper coordinates the motion of its legs with these incredibly precise gears. Making long leaps accurately requires that the legs be in perfect sync. If one leg flexed even a fraction of a millisecond before the other, the insect would lose power and tumble erratically. As one leg begins to move, the interacting gears start the other leg too. With the teeth engaged, the gears spin at a whopping 50,000 teeth per second, and the bug is propelled with maximum power and coordination. As science learns more about the structures of living organisms, we seem to be finding limitless examples of mechanisms that are both precise and purposeful, both remarkably configured and beautifully functional.
Michael Behe, he can be found at michaelbehe.com. He's worth checking out. He's got lots of interesting things about the design in nature and intelligent design. Richard Dawkins, the most famous promoter of evolution in the world, and he spends his life criticizing God. There's his books, The God Delusion, Outgrowing God. Now he's going to be asked a question now, and you just watch his answer.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop one? I think.
I'm recording.
Okay. There's a popular misunderstanding of evolution which says that fish turned into reptiles and reptiles turned into mammals, and so somehow we ought to be able to look around the world today and look at our ancestors. We ought to be able to see the intermediates between fish and reptiles, or between reptiles and mammals. We ought to be able to see fish.
So Dawkins, he can't give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process that increases the information in the genome. He just waffles on, doesn't he? After not being able to answer the question, he just waffles on. He does not answer the question because nobody can. There are few scientific papers claiming beneficial mutations do increase the information in the genome. However, if you really scrutinise these papers thoroughly, you will find that they are extremely weak and full of evolutionary imagination and deception. On 30th May in 2018, so that's about 6 years ago now, I downloaded this paper from Tech Times. It's an evolutionary scientific news website, and I was surprised at this particular paper. Massive genetic study reveals 90% of Earth's animals appeared at the same time. Sounds as though it's just come straight out the Bible. The origin of the paper, Human Evolution, volume 33, and it's got a scroll now. I downloaded the paper and you can download this for yourself. But the summary by E.N.C.O.D.E, who's the science journalist, said this: over the last decade, hundreds of scientists, not one or two scientists, hundreds of scientists collected around 5 million DNA barcodes from 100,000 animal species in different parts of the globe. Stokel and Thaler, they were the scientists leading the program, looked through these 5 million genetic imprints to find one of the most surprising discoveries about evolution to date. They were all born around the same time. In analysing the cytochrome oxidized subunit 1 of 100,000 species, Stokel and Thaler arrived at the conclusion that most animals appeared simultaneously. They found that the neutral mutation across species were not as varied as expected. So DNA barcodes, that's quite a relevant, a recent discovery and form of investigation and research. So as to how that could have happened, it's unclear, stated Thaler. Now we continue. E.N.C.O.D.E says landmark new research that involves analysing millions of DNA barcodes has debunked much about what we know today about the evolution of species. In a massive genetic study, senior research associate at the Programme for the Human Environment at Rockefeller University, Mark Stokel, and University of Basel geneticist David Thaler discovered that virtually 90% of all animals on Earth appeared at right around the same time. More specifically, they found out that 9 out of 10 animal species on the planet came into being at the same time as humans did. This conclusion is very surprising, says Thaler, and I fought against it as hard as he could. Well, he fought against it as hard as he could because he knew he was going to get a lot of flack from the evolutionists because they don't like this kind of thing coming up in their scientific literature. And I actually wonder if he still is an evolutionist, because he was an evolutionist. In Romans chapter 1 verse 20 we read, "For ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature and attributes, that is, his eternal power and divinity, have been made intelligible and clearly discernible in and through the things that have been made, his handiworks. So men are without excuse, altogether without any defence or justification." We only have to look around us. We only have to look at all the life on the earth. It's beautiful. It's so complex. There's no way it could have evolved. You know, the petals on the flowers, there's a rose petal on the right. It's got the Fibonacci golden ratio sequence in it. There's an egg on the left. That's got the golden ratio in it. The fishes in the seas, the insects, the mammals, the reptiles. It's all so wonderful. If evolution was true, we'd see lots of ugly things, but we don't. I recommend that you have a look at the Fibonacci sequence because that shows us so much of the design in life that could not have evolved. This world and all life was created by an intelligent designer, and that is God. If we investigate the empirical science, as it's obvious. Not the hypotheses or the theories or the just so stories, the real empirical science, it's obvious. We owe our lives to the intelligent designer. Without him, we wouldn't exist. And we have the written word from him in the Bible. And if we explore the Bible thoroughly, it can easily be determined that it is divine in nature. For example, amazing detailed prophecies that have come to pass over time. There's many messianic prophecies in the Old Testament that were written hundreds to thousands of years before Jesus even came. Prophecies which could only have been foretold by an almighty God who knows everything from the beginning to the very end of times. There are many prophecies in the Bible about nations and kingdoms, the history of our earth, of kingdoms that have come and gone, and they were all prophesied by Almighty God. It's been written for our benefit, for our guidance and for our salvation. And I personally like to thank him, because I know that I wouldn't exist without him. And I look forward to his promises he's made that he will restore the world to a beautiful, wonderful place as it once was before, when the Lord Jesus returns. At the end of the day, we all have choices. We can explore the abundant solid evidence that abounds for the complexity of life, like the kinesin walking protein, the bacterial flagellum motor, gears on bugs. Or we can choose to be willingly ignorant of the undeniable facts about all the scientific empirical evidence that has been discovered in the last few decades by the E.N.C.O.D.E Human Animal Genome Program. Question evolution. If you investigate it thoroughly and look past all the just so stories and look for empirical evidence when you're looking at evolution, it's all based on assumptions, wishful thinking, and very imaginative, deceptive stories. Just think about the teaspoonful of DNA and how much information is in that. And we know now that evolution cannot produce information. Evolution is dead in the water.
Game over.
Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.